3 widowers in the Alberta foothills had each placed an advertisement for a housekeeper in the same Dominion Land Settlement newsletter on the same Tuesday in October of 1887, and not one of them had thought to mention it to the others. That was the first strange thing. The second strange thing came 6 weeks later, when 3 women stepped off the same Canadian Pacific Railway coach at the Pincher Creek station on the same gray November morning, each carrying a single trunk, each holding a letter of correspondence addressed to a different man, and each one looking at the other two with an expression that could only be described as recognition. Because they were sisters, not loosely, not by marriage or circumstance, blood sisters, raised in the same house outside Quebec City, daughters of the same father, same mother, same kitchen table, where they had eaten porridge every morning for 20 years and argued over who got the last of the maple sugar. Their names were Harriet, Cecily, and June. Harriet was the eldest at 28, a schoolteacher who had spent 4 years in a one-room schoolhouse outside Lévis before the school board cut funding and left her without employment or prospects. She was precise and quiet, and had a way of looking at a problem from 3 angles before she spoke. Willet, Cuban cigar. She had answered Mr. Calloway's advertisement because he had mentioned in his letter that his daughter was 7 years old and had not been in a formal classroom since her mother passed. Cecily was 25, and she had been the one to find the newsletter in the first place, tucked between 2 crates at the dry goods store where she had been working since their father died 2 winters ago. She had a practical mind and restless hands and could not stand the idea of spending another winter in a house that no longer felt like home. She answered Mr. Drummond's advertisement because he ran a working cattle operation and needed someone who could manage a household of 5 men without losing her composure. Cecily had grown up managing a household. She knew exactly what that meant. June was 22, and she had answered Mr. Alderton's advertisement almost by accident, or so she told herself. She had been addressing the envelopes for Harriet and Cecily, and somewhere between the second and third she had written her own name at the top of a 4th sheet of paper and started writing before she could think too carefully about it. June was the quietest of the 3, the one who watched things before she spoke about them. She painted when she could find the time, small watercolors of birds and river bends and the way the frost sat on a window in early December. They had not planned to arrive together. They had not even told each other they were going. That was the part that Harriet would think about for years afterward, the fact that each of them had made the same decision in the same week, packed the same kind of trunk, and boarded the same westbound train without saying a word to the others. And it was only when they found themselves standing on the same platform, in the same cold morning air, that they understood something larger than any of them had arranged was at work. The station master, a round-cheeked man named Briggs, who had worked the Pincher Creek platform for 11 years, later said he had never seen 3 women go so pale and then start laughing so hard in all his life. He also said he had never seen 3 men look so confused. When they came to collect their respective housekeepers and found them standing together in a cluster, arms around each other, still catching their breath. The 3 men arrived within 20 minutes of each other, which was its own small miracle, given that their properties were spread across 12 miles of foothills terrain, and none of them had coordinated the trip. Malcolm Calloway came first with his wagon, a tall man with a dark beard, going gray at the jaw, his 7-year-old daughter Bess sitting beside him on the bench, with her boots not quite reaching the footboard. Then Fletcher Drummond, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, a man who spoke carefully and meant every word. And finally Hugh Alderton, youngest of the 3 at 34, who had lost his wife to fever the previous spring and still carried that loss in the set of his shoulders even when he was trying not to show it. They did not know each other well. They were neighbors in the way that men are neighbors when they live miles apart, and the winter keeps them mostly to themselves. They had met at the Pincher Creek trading post, at the cattle auction in September, at the small Anglican church where the minister came through every third Sunday. They knew each other's names, knew the general shape of each other's situations. That was about the extent of it. Standing on the platform looking at three women who were clearly together and clearly sisters, all three of them had more or less the same thought, which none of them said aloud. It was Bess who said it. "Papa," she said, looking up at her father with perfect seriousness, "did you all order from the same place?" The laughter broke the ice, as laughter usually does. It was Harriet who spoke first. Once the introductions had been made and the situation explained, she was accustomed to being the one to speak first. She looked at the three men in front of her with the same calm attention she had once used to assess a room full of 8-year-olds who were all trying to pretend they hadn't been fighting at recess. She said, "I imagine this is a surprise for all of us. I suggest we not make any decisions on a train platform in November. If each of us is still willing to proceed under the original terms of correspondence, we are willing to do the same." That was Harriet. 6 sentences and the whole thing settled, or at least the immediate part of it was settled. The rest would take considerably longer. Malcolm Calloway's property was the furthest north, a 200-acre homestead called Clearwater that sat against a ridge of lodgepole pines with a creek running along its eastern edge. The house was larger than it looked from the road, 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up, built by Malcolm and his wife in the first years of their marriage, with the help of 2 men from the Piacani community who had been neighbors in the truest sense of the word. The house was clean, but it had the particular emptiness of a place where someone had recently been missing. There was a rocking chair by the stove that nobody sat in. There was a blue and white cup on the kitchen shelf that was different from all the others. Harriet noticed these things and said nothing about them. She understood that a house had to be ready before it could be talked about. She made herself useful in ways that did not draw attention. She got the kitchen organized within 2 days, and the school lessons started within 4. Bess had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness and a hunger for learning that Harriet recognized immediately as the kind that needed to be fed carefully in the right order or it would consume itself. Within a week, they were reading together in the evenings, Bess curled in the corner of the settle, with a lamp pulled close, Harriet at the table with her own book, the silence between them comfortable and productive. Malcolm watched this from the doorway one night, without either of them noticing. He stood there for a moment, and then quietly went back out to the barn. Cecily's situation at the Drummond property was louder and more immediate. Fletcher Drummond ran cattle with 4 ranch hands who ate like horses and expected 3 meals a day regardless of weather or circumstance. The bunkhouse was a separate building, but the kitchen fed everyone. And within her first morning, Cecily had assessed the situation, identified the 3 most critical inefficiencies in the supply chain, and made a list of what needed to be ordered from Pincher Creek before the December weather closed in. Fletcher Drummond stood in his own kitchen doorway and watched her reorganize his storage shelves with an expression that was equal parts admiration and alarm. "I had a system," he said. "You had a habit," Cecily said pleasantly without stopping. "A system has a reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the reason for putting the flour on the left?" "Because you're right-handed and you reach for it first. Now you won't knock the salt onto the floor every time." He thought about this. "I've knocked the salt onto the floor every time for 4 years," he said. "I know. I can see the stain." That was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that for a long time. June arrived at Hugh Alderton's property on a day when the first real snow was coming down in earnest, fat flakes that stuck to everything and muffled the world to a kind of padded quiet. The property was smaller than the other 2, 160 acres that Hugh had been working alone since spring. The house was orderly but sparse. There was very little on the walls. There was paint on the windowsill, though, a faded stripe of ochre yellow that someone had put there and never finished. And June noticed it immediately and felt her chest do a small, complicated thing. Hugh Alderton was not a man who knew how to receive help gracefully. He showed her the house, explained the routine, answered her questions directly, and then went back outside to do something that probably could have waited. June recognized this as what it was: a man who was used to doing everything himself and didn't know yet how to stop. She did not push. She settled in, learned the rhythms of the place, and on her third evening there, she asked if she could use the corner of the sitting room for a small table. When Hugh asked what for, she showed him a set of watercolor paints she had wrapped in cloth inside her trunk. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at the bare walls. Then he said, "There's a view of the ridge from the east window that's something in the morning light." "I know," said June. "I've been looking at it." It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. The three sisters sent letters to each other every Sunday. This was a habit from childhood that they had maintained through all their years. Apart, a Sunday letter written in the morning before anything else, regardless of what else was happening. Sometimes the letters were long. Sometimes they were only a paragraph. But they always came, and the arrival of Harriet's careful handwriting, or Cecily's quick slanting script, or June's small careful letters, was the anchor that kept each of them steady in an unfamiliar world. In those letters they were honest with each other in ways they were not yet honest with anyone else. Harriet wrote, "The little girl watches me when she thinks I am not looking. I understand the impulse. She is deciding whether to trust me. I am trying very hard not to rush her." Cecily wrote, "He argues with everything I say for about 30 seconds, and then does it anyway. I have started just waiting out the 30 seconds. It is efficient." June wrote, "I painted the ridge this morning. When I came down, he was standing in the doorway looking at it. He didn't say anything, but he moved the lamp so the light would fall on it better." They did not write about the future. That was a thing the Baxter sisters had learned early. Their father had been a man who planned constantly and adjusted constantly, and was still somehow always surprised by what happened. They had learned instead to attend to the present carefully and let the future declare itself when it was ready. It declared itself in February in a way none of them had anticipated. A man arrived in Pincher Creek on the second Friday of that month, traveling on the eastbound CPR coach with two other men, all three of them wearing the particular expression of people who have come a long way and are not here for pleasant reasons. His name was Rupert Gaines, and he was a creditor, or claimed to be. He had a document bearing the name of a Montreal firm and a legal seal that Constable Henderson would later determine was genuine. And he was looking for 3 women who had left Quebec in the autumn, owing a debt that their late father had contracted before his death. The debt was real. Their father, a good man in most respects, had borrowed money to keep the house through a bad winter and had died before he could repay it. The sisters had known about it. They had left Quebec believing it would be settled through the sale of the house and the modest contents of the estate. They had not known, because the letter had arrived after they left, that the sale had fallen through and the debt had transferred. Gaines had found them by tracing the railway tickets. It had taken him 3 months, which was long enough that he had developed a considerable additional interest in the amount and a hard quality in his patience. He arrived at Malcolm Calloway's door on a Saturday morning when the sky was a flat white and the temperature had not risen above -15 for a week. Malcolm answered the door himself because his ranch hand had gone to Pincher Creek for supplies, and Harriet was in the back of the house doing lessons with Bess, and he had not wanted to interrupt them. He listened to what Gaines had to say. He looked at the document. He said, "Wait here," and went to find Harriet. She read the document at the kitchen table while Bess watched from the settle, sensing without being told that this was a grown-up matter that required her silence. Harriet read it twice. Her face did not change. This was something Harriet did when she was frightened. She went very still, as though movement might cause the bad thing to become more real. Then she looked up at Malcolm Calloway and said, "I need to send word to my sisters." "I'll send word myself," he said. "Right now." He did. He rode to Fletcher Drummond's property, first because it was closer. Arriving in the time it took Harriet to make tea, and read the document a third time. Fletcher Drummond listened, saddled his horse, and rode to Hugh Alderton's, while Malcolm came back. By midday all three men were at the Calloway property, along with Cecily and June. The six of them sat around Malcolm's kitchen table, while Bess was sent upstairs with a book and the particular instruction that this was a private conversation. Gaines was waiting in the front room, having been offered a chair and a cup of coffee, with the firm politeness that passes in that part of the country for a warning. The sisters explained what they knew. The men listened without interrupting, which was something all three women would remember afterward. Not because it was surprising, though it was somewhat, but because of the quality of the listening. These were men who were used to solving problems with their hands and their horses and their own resources, and all three of them were sitting very still and paying very careful attention, and none of them was looking at the sisters with the particular expression that means, "How did you let this happen?" which was what each of the sisters had been bracing for without realizing it. Fletcher Drummond spoke first. He asked 3 questions in a row, the kind of questions that go to the center of a problem. How much was the debt? What were the legal terms of the transfer? And whether Gaines had any authority beyond presenting the document. Cecily answered all 3 precisely. She had read the document twice as fast as Harriet and retained it completely. Hugh Alderton, who had been quiet through all of it, said, "He can't compel anything without a Canadian court order. He's a Montreal creditor in Alberta Territory. He has a document, not a judgment." Everyone looked at him. "My uncle was a solicitor," he said, with the mild expression of a man producing a relevant fact. "I used to read his cases when I visited, for something to do." That changed the shape of the problem considerably. What followed was not simple. There were letters written to a solicitor in Calgary, a process that took weeks and cost money that was pooled between the 3 men without discussion, in the way that men who have decided something sometimes act before they say it. There was a difficult conversation with Constable Henderson, who agreed that Gaines had no immediate legal standing in the territory, but advised that the debt itself was real and would need to be addressed. There was a longer conversation among the 6 of them around the same kitchen table, in which the practical arithmetic of the situation was laid out plainly. The sisters had come to Alberta to work. They had been working. They would continue to work. The debt was real, and it would be paid, not because Rupert Gaines deserved to collect it, but because their father had contracted it in good faith. They were their father's daughters, and that meant something to them. The men did not argue with this. They also did not let it stand as the only option on the table. It was Malcolm who said it, in the way that Malcolm said most things. Directly, and only after he had thought about it for long enough to be certain, he said, "There is another arrangement that would change the legal situation considerably, and also, if I am honest, address something I have been thinking about since November." He was looking at Harriet when he said it. The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture to it. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines along the ridge. Harriet said, "Mr. Calloway, you should know that I don't make decisions out of necessity when I haven't made them out of choice first." "I know that," he said. "That is why I'm asking you to think about it as a choice, not a solution." It was not romantic, exactly, the way it happened. None of it was, in the way that stories sometimes make these things seem. It was more like the way a creek finds its level. Not dramatic, but absolutely certain once it has found the right path. Fletcher Drummond did not make speeches. He waited until he and Cecily were alone in his kitchen. One evening, after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, and he said, I'd like to continue this arrangement on a permanent basis if you're willing. I mean marriage. I'm not good at sideways approaches to things. Cecily had looked at him for exactly the 30 seconds she had learned to wait, and then said, "Neither am I." Hugh Alderton left a note on June's painting table one morning. It said, "There is a view of the river bend in spring that is better than the ridge. I would like you to be here to paint it. I would like to be here to see it." June had read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and not said anything until that evening, when she said, "Yes." 3 weddings in the Alberta foothills in the spring of 1888, each one small and practical, and held on a property that now belonged to all of the people standing on it. The minister came through on his regular third Sunday circuit and performed all 3 ceremonies on consecutive weekends, which he said was the most efficient use of a trip he had made in 30 years. Bess Calloway wore a dress that Harriet had made from a bolt of blue wool and stood at her father's side with the expression of a person who has had a theory confirmed. She had decided she approved of Harriet in December. She had simply been waiting for the adults to catch up. Rupert Gaines returned to Montreal with a certified bank draft and an expression of a man who had accomplished something without quite understanding how. The debt was settled. The legal matter was closed. What it had cost, the 3 men remained their business, and the 3 sisters repaid it over the following 2 years in the way that people who take their obligations seriously repay things, steadily, without ceremony, in full. The Sunday letters continued. They always would. Even when the 3 properties were close enough that the sisters saw each other every week at church, at the trading post, at the gatherings that accumulated as the community grew, the Sunday letters kept coming. Shorter now, sometimes only a few lines, but always there. Harriet wrote, "Bess read 3 chapters on her own last night. She did not tell me. She waited until morning to show me, so it would be a proper announcement." Cecily wrote, "He knocked the salt onto the floor this morning. The new stain is exactly on top of the old one. I am leaving it." June wrote, "I finished the Riverbend painting today." He hung it in the sitting room without being asked, directly across from the window, so the light falls on it in the afternoon. He knew exactly where it needed to go. They had come west on the same train without telling each other, each one following the same instinct toward the same horizon, and they had arrived to find that the horizon was larger than any of them had imagined, and that there was room in it for all of them. That was the third strange thing, and it was the best one.